Story 1. The Midnight Watch. I was 28, and this unsettling experience happened 2 years ago, just a few days before Christmas. I had taken the whole week off from having to go into the office. At my job, we had this flexible schedule where we could basically decide when we needed to be physically present. I'd managed to bank up enough remote days to allow me to work entirely from home that week. I was aware of a major winter storm that was forecast to hit the area around the holiday, and frankly, I just wanted to be home, have some relaxed workdays, and avoid the pre-Christmas chaos. Our company's policy for remote work was fairly straightforward. As long as you met your deadlines, the rest was up to you. There were a few other minor rules, but this basically gave me the freedom to set my own hours. I've always preferred sleeping in and then working late into the night. On this particular day, I finally logged in around noon. The initial hours of work were, for lack of a better word, quiet and uneventful. I sat there, slowly sipping my coffee, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. As the afternoon wore on, the weather began to change drastically. The wind outside picked up, growing steadily heavier, occasionally slamming against the window right next to my desk. Soon after, the first flakes of snow began to fall. By 3 or 4 in the afternoon, it was already pitch black outside, the sky choked by the thick, ominous overhead clouds and the sheer volume of snow that was relentlessly pouring down onto the neighborhood. I had initially planned to go out and grab dinner, but given the rapidly deteriorating road conditions, I made the easy decision to just stay put for the remainder of the night. I continued working at my desk for another couple of hours. The sun had completely vanished, and the full force of the winter storm had arrived. I deliberately left the window shades up, enjoying the sight of the heavy snowfall from the warm, safe interior of my office. Then, completely out of the blue, a light flickered outside. I lifted my gaze and saw a thin, distinct beam of light moving erratically across the exterior. It was, without a doubt, a flashlight. I leaned back from my workspace, staring intently out the window for what felt like 10 solid seconds, watching the small, moving light. My curiosity quickly got the better of me, compelling me to stand up and walk over to the window to investigate. Why would anyone be outside right now? It had to be absolutely freezing. I pressed close to the glass, peering out and attempting to look down the side of my house. I managed to spot the light again, but before I could trace the beam back to the person holding it, it suddenly switched off. Or maybe the person ducked behind something. Couldn't be sure. It was far too dark, and the continuous, blinding snow had essentially obscured my entire view. With nothing more to see, I sighed and returned to my desk. Honestly, I initially rationalized it, thinking perhaps a neighbor had lost a pet in the storm, or was just searching for a misplaced item. I didn't spend much time worrying about it, forcing myself to refocus on my work while the blizzard raged just beyond the glass. Over the next 2 hours or so, the house was a constant chorus of creaks and settling noises, a natural result of the intense wind and cold. But several times, I was certain I heard something slightly louder, something more distinct. These sounds were jarring enough to make me pause my work, look away from my screen, and strain my ears, hoping to hear the sound again and identify its source. I never did. I kept telling myself it was just the house, the old structure groaning under the pressure of the elements. The thought that it could be anything else felt incredibly far-fetched and ridiculous. That was my internal monologue until I heard a much louder thud. It sounded less like the house settling and more like something breaking, or at the very least a heavy impact against a surface, and it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. I immediately stood up from my desk and walked out into the silent hallway. I waited, hearing nothing, before moving carefully downstairs. Everything in the main living area appeared and sounded completely normal. Not that I could hear much over the heavy howling of the wind, but there were no subsequent loud impacts. In all honesty, I wasn't frightened enough yet to perform a full, thorough search of every room in the house, especially with no further noises to justify it. So, I started heading back up to my office. I had made it almost to the top of the stairs when, abruptly, There was a quiet click sound, and the entire house plunged into darkness. The power had gone out. I froze instantly on the step. The whole interior of the house was now pitch black. Because of the raging snowstorm outside, absolutely no light managed to penetrate the windows. I couldn't even make out the shape of my own hands held directly in front of my face. The storm must have knocked out the neighborhood power, I thought, or maybe just tripped the breaker. I began moving slowly, cautiously back down the staircase, feeling for each step with my foot as I blindly and carefully made my descent to the lower hallway. The basement door, which housed the breaker box, was located at the far end of this hallway. So, I started moving along the wall, tracing my hand against it to ensure I kept going straight. Then I heard something. I stopped walking immediately. It was a sound of something moving, a sort of muffled noise. It was coming from behind the basement door. The sound grew closer and closer until, with a quiet, horrifying creak, the basement door began to open. I could feel my eyes widening in terror as I stared down the hallway that was completely consumed by darkness. I took one single, quiet step back and slipped soundlessly through the open doorway of the bathroom, which was right next to me. I still couldn't see anything, and I knew that trying to close the door would make a giveaway sound, so I left it ajar. Slow, deliberate, and quiet footsteps began moving down the hallway. I held my breath, every muscle tense, determined not to make the slightest sound. The footsteps drew nearer and nearer until I felt certain they were directly outside the bathroom where I was hiding. Then, the footsteps passed right by the open doorway. I never saw the person, not even a shadow, as they walked just 2 or 3 feet from me. That's how absolute the darkness was. The slow footsteps continued moving through the hallway until they reached the base of the stairs. From that point on, it was carpet, and I couldn't hear anything at all. Suddenly, the roar of the snowstorm outside crashed back into my hearing, almost feeling amplified by the empty silence that had descended inside the home. The person could have stopped walking and still been standing right at the bottom of the steps, waiting. But I took the desperate chance that they had continued upstairs, and I decided to make a run for it. I slipped out of the bathroom and moved blindly toward the other side of the house, stretching my hands out in front of me to avoid crashing into a wall. I reached the garage door, fumbled for my keys, and hurried out the side door, sprinting across the driveway to my car. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and drove away without looking back, immediately using the SOS device in my car to contact the police. Unsurprisingly, the intruder was gone by the time the officers arrived. From the evidence the police gathered, after breaking in and deliberately cutting the power, the person had gone essentially straight upstairs, heading directly into my office and then into the bedroom and nowhere else. This strongly suggested that this person was definitely there and specifically looking for me. What remains truly unsettling is the probability that the person knew me and was intimately familiar enough with the layout of my house to walk perfectly straight through it in complete darkness and head directly upstairs to my office, the place they knew I would be. It could have even been someone I spoke to regularly, a person I had absolutely no idea harbored such horrifying intentions. The incident made me question everything and everyone. I eventually moved away, living under a cloud of constant paranoia, viewing essentially every coworker or friend I wasn't extremely close with deep suspicion. Since relocating, nothing else has happened. I truly hope I never have any updates to give, but if anything else occurs, I'll be sure to share. Story 2. The Highway Cafe. I'd been driving since early that morning, pushing to make it from Minneapolis all the way to my sister's place in Montana before the weekend arrived. The plan was for a quick winter trip. It was just me, my faithful old Subaru, and a steady supply of awful gas station coffee. Everything went smoothly until the snow started falling once I drove a little farther north and reached the more remote, isolated sections of the highway. It began lightly, just a few flakes here and there, but it escalated rapidly around the time the sun finally disappeared. It quickly became what felt like a solid wall of white, an impenetrable curtain that even the full power of my headlights was struggling to pierce. After an hour of gripping the wheel and squinting into the storm, the road was completely covered in snow, making it genuinely difficult to discern whether I was even staying within the lanes. The stress was immense. I resolved that I would pull off at the very next place I saw, no matter what it was, just to wait out the blizzard. I think it was about 15 minutes after I made that decision that I barely spotted a flickering light on the side of the road. The snow was falling so fiercely that I couldn't even read the sign before I swung the car into the entrance. The parking lot was small, holding only 3 other vehicles. One was conspicuously buried deep under the accumulating snow, and the other 2 looked like they had pulled in not long before me. I parked, and from the shape and look of the structure, I could make out that it was some kind of roadside cafe. I had been desperately hoping for a motel, but I figured if I was going to be stuck waiting out the weather, I might as well head inside and get a fresh cup of coffee. I got out of the car and walked straight into the blizzard, hurrying inside, already feeling the sharp chill of the near-freezing air. This was certainly not the kind of place I, a city person, was accustomed to visiting, and I immediately felt very out of place. It was a tiny, old-fashioned cafe with a small bar situated near the entrance. 2 men were sitting there, each with a mug of coffee, and 1 woman was working alone behind the counter. When I opened the door, the silence inside was striking. None of them were speaking or moving. However, all 3 looked up and immediately greeted me. It felt like I had walked in right in the middle of a profoundly awkward silence. I tried to dismiss the feeling, assuming I was overthinking it. I took a seat near the 2 men at the bar. It turned out both of the guys had the same idea as me, pulling over to escape the violent blizzard. I ordered a coffee from the woman and carried the hot mug over to a seat by the front window, where I watched the snow continue its heavy descent outside, burying our cars. I couldn't shake a weird, uneasy feeling about one of the men at the bar. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and the best way I could describe his appearance was that he looked half dead. I couldn't tell if it was the exhausting drive, the boredom, or if he was simply having an exceptionally bad day. Oddly, once I moved away from the bar and sat by the window, all conversation ceased again, and the cafe fell back into the same heavy silence I had first encountered. We all sat there for a few minutes in a strangely tense quiet before one of the men abruptly stood up and muttered something about trying to reach his nearby cabin before the roads were completely closed. No one else said a word. I watched him through the window as he walked out to his car and got in. He sat there for a moment, likely waiting for the engine to warm up. Then the other man also got up, and without saying anything at all, he simply left the cafe. Feeling deeply unsettled, I moved from the window back over to the bar, immediately asking the worker what the deal was with those 2 guys. She shrugged, explaining that they had pulled in around the same time and looked like they were arguing intensely in the parking lot before they came inside. Since then, she said, they hadn't spoken much. She figured it was just an instance of road rage or some similar confrontation. I stayed at the bar for a while, engaging in small talk with her about the severity of the blizzard and general topics. During those 30 minutes, no one else came into the cafe. Eventually, I walked back over to the window to check on the snow and see if the storm had perhaps begun to ease up a bit. That's when I noticed both of the men's cars were still there. Crucially, though, neither of the men was inside their cars, nor were they anywhere outside the vehicles. They were simply gone. This sight immediately sent a shiver down my spine. It had been quite a while since they had left the building. There was no conceivable way they would be out walking around in that blizzard for this long. I went closer to the front door for a better look, then decided to take a few steps outside and peer around the immediate area. The brutal, sharp cold instantly hit my face. The snow, while not quite as blinding as before, still made visibility extremely difficult. Aside from the harsh, ceaseless wind, it was eerily quiet out there. There was absolutely no sign of either man. The entire situation gave me a profoundly uneasy feeling, to the point where all I wanted to do was leave. I dragged my feet through the fresh snow toward my car. My plan was to start the engine and let it warm up while I waited safely back inside the cafe before making my escape. But it wouldn't start. It wasn't even struggling to turn over. The engine wouldn't make the slightest sound when I turned the key. It had only been perhaps 40 minutes since I'd arrived at the cafe, and my car hadn't had a single issue before this night. My gut instantly told me that one of the men had something to do with this. I know that, at this point, it sounds completely paranoid, like I was being overly skeptical from the jump, but I just knew it somehow. And then, as I sat gripping the wheel, still trying desperately to get the engine to catch, I saw someone. One of the men was walking out of the woods located directly behind the cafe. He was little more than a dark, indistinct figure, heavily obscured by the darkness and the ongoing snowfall, but he was moving straight back toward the parked cars. I quickly scrambled out and rushed back inside the cafe, immediately throwing the lock on the front door. The woman worker asked me why I had done that and what was going on, to which I quickly explained what I had just seen and urged her to call 911 immediately. She looked unsure, but she picked up the phone and did it anyway. A minute later, the man appeared right at the door. He tried to walk in, pressing his weight against the wood. When he realized it was locked, he locked eyes with me through the small glass pane and began banging violently on the door. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was terrifyingly pale, but he still carried that same unsettling half-dead expression. Through our prolonged eye contact and the barrier of the locked door, I think he knew that I was onto him, or whatever the hell sinister plan was unfolding. He didn't stay more than 10 seconds before he suddenly ran back toward his car. When the police finally arrived, only 3 cars were in the parking lot. Mine, the woman's, and the other man's. The creepy guy had successfully made his escape. Unfortunately, this terrifying night did not end with the typical "he got away before anything happened" scenario. The officers followed some faint footprints in the snow that led into the woods behind the cafe and found the body of the other guy. None of his personal belongings were missing, suggesting it was simply an act of violence. And just as disturbing, they found that his car wouldn't start either. The mechanics later discovered that it had the exact same issue as my car. The ignition line had been deliberately cut. With all that information, the whole horrific story pieced itself together. When both men had pulled in that night, at some point, the creepy guy cut the line on the other man's car to prevent him from leaving. Then, he simply waited for the man to head back outside, where he followed him out into the darkness. And of course, with the car disabled and no possibility of escape, the victim was either dragged into the woods or had tried desperately to run away. Regardless, it all ended the same way. With the heavy winds from the blizzard, the woman and I inside the cafe had no idea any of this violence was taking place, all of it happening just 20 feet outside the front doors. But at some point during the 30 minutes before I became aware of anything, the man had also cut the line on my car, which meant he most likely had the very same horrific plans for me that night. I was eventually able to make it safely to my sister's place, but aside from a few brief phone calls to check on me, I never heard anything about the man being found. I don't think I'll be going on any road trips during the winter again. And thinking about the chilling image of that man walking out of the pitch-black woods through the blizzard toward me, now knowing exactly what his true intent was, still makes my heart pound uncontrollably. Story 3. The Dark Delivery. This incident took place around Christmas time last year. I believe it was sometime between Christmas Day and New Year's. I was home from college for winter break, but I still had bills and expenses to cover. So, whenever I wasn't busy with family obligations, I worked delivering food for a service like DoorDash. It was snowing that particular night, but the accumulation wasn't heavy enough to pack the roads to the point where driving became genuinely dangerous. Crucially, though, it was enough snow to convince most people to stay inside and order food, rather than venture out. Nights like these were fantastic for making decent money. Orders were steady until about 10 o'clock. Things slowed down after that, but I was still getting consistent pings. This specific order was just like any other, perhaps slightly further away than usual, about a 20-minute drive. My hometown was small but quite spread out, with many houses and small settlements scattered on the outskirts, deep in the woods. However, when my GPS directed me to the spot where I was supposed to deliver this particular order, I felt an immediate surge of uncertainty. The directions had led me off the main road and onto a much smaller, unmaintained forest road, eventually stopping at a point where a gravel driveway was supposed to be, leading deep into the trees. But the entire area was completely snowed in. No one had plowed or shoveled, and I couldn't see any lights. No porch lights, no outdoor fixtures, to indicate a house was even there. I stayed in my running car and called the customer, thinking there must have been an error with the address or the map pin. He answered right away. The man sounded like he was in his mid-30s and was a heavy smoker, judging by the deep, raspy quality of his voice. I explained that I was at the location marked on the map for the drop-off, but that I couldn't see an open driveway, a house, or really anything at all. The guy responded that it was probably covered in snow. The way he said it implied that I should have found that obvious and not bothered him. I replied, saying I thought I could make out where the driveway was supposed to be, but that I was not comfortable driving my car through it. He then gave a distinctly snarky answer about how this was precisely why he had ordered delivery, and that if I wasn't going to deliver it, then what the hell was the point? I didn't entirely agree with his assessment, and the response seemed incredibly rude and aggressive. But in the moment, I guess I just folded under the pressure and said, okay. I didn't want him to cancel the order or, worse, leave me a negative review, especially after I had already driven all the way out to this remote spot. Looking back, I've since checked all the rules, and now I know that if I don't have safe access to the driveway or delivery location, the fault is on the customer. But at the time, I wasn't sure. So, after he hung up, I got out of the car with the order bag, locked the doors, and started trudging through the snow. It wasn't terribly deep, but on a forest driveway that clearly hadn't been maintained, I knew my car would have gotten into a lot of trouble and likely been completely stuck. It was also extremely difficult to tell where the actual path was. I mostly tried to follow what I thought was a slight clearing between the trees, but with no lights to guide me, I really had no idea where I was walking. I kept glancing back at my car, watching it recede further and further behind me. It was the only real sense of distance I had because everything up ahead was profoundly dark and featureless. It all looked like the same stretch of desolate forest. Suddenly, I heard a sound off to my left. A distinct, low crunch that sounded eerily similar to a heavy boot stepping on packed snow. It was far away, barely within the reach of my hearing. I looked out into the blackness and even tried turning my phone flashlight on, but the beam did absolutely nothing against the crushing darkness. I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear the noise again. So I kept walking. The bone-deep cold began to seriously set in, and the endless darkness ahead had me completely rethinking the whole situation. I figured by this point, I should have at least seen the house or some kind of sign to confirm I was going the right way. I stopped dead in my tracks and stood there for a moment, an unsettling realization dawning on me. I looked around, and I know it sounds stupid that it took me this long, but the thought finally struck me. There might not actually be a house here. This whole thing could be some sort of twisted trick to lure me out to this isolated location. A terrifying thought to have while standing alone in a snowy, dark forest. I took out my phone and decided that if the customer didn't answer or tried to convince me to keep walking one more time, I would simply leave and cancel the order. I pressed call and held the phone up to my ear, listening to the first ring. It rang twice before I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I snapped my head around, seeing a light, a tiny pinprick, far out in the trees. Then, just as suddenly, it shut off, and half a second later the call dropped. I didn't bother waiting or attempting to rationalize anything. I instantly turned and began sprinting back the way I came. The frantic, loud crunching of the snow beneath my running boots covered up whatever sounds might have been coming from behind me, like if the man was chasing me or not. This uncertainty made the whole sprint even more terrifying, not knowing what, if anything, was right behind me. I ran all the way back to my car, and before I even reached the door, I saw that something was wrong. The car was leaning heavily to one side, which drew my eyes immediately to one of the tires. It was completely flattened. He had slashed it. I threw myself in, started the engine anyway, and sped out of there on the flat tire. I called the police on my way out, but aside from taking down my statement, They were pretty useless and genuinely didn't seem to take the whole terrifying incident seriously. To me, the situation is crystal clear. The man was leading me out into the deep woods for a malicious reason, and he even went as far as to slash the tires on my car to either keep me trapped there or prevent my escape. I don't know what I would have found had I kept walking further into those woods, or what unimaginable thing would have happened to me.